Dogs are often known as the best-known faithful human companions. They need affection but understand your agony, love, and pain. It is a story of a man rejected by his father and suffered extreme violence and misery, but how his dogs never failed to understand him makes the story a remarkable cinematic masterpiece. In the middle of the night, the patrolling police stop a vehicle on a checkpost like all others on the highway, but they are stunned when a man in a cosplay dress shows his face. Dr. Evelyn receives a call in the middle of the night, which she attends anyway. She has to rush to the police station to get the initial report of the suspect to a psychiatrist. As a single mother and the sole breadwinner of her family, she half-heartedly gets ready to go and puts her baby beside her mom. The moment she sees the suspect in the investigation room in a girl's dress and a wig, smoking cigarettes one after another, she nicely warns him to stop smoking on the premises as it's not allowed. And in spite of listening to her and giving an introduction, the strange man demands to know Evelyn's name, occupation, and love life details. Evelyn briefly reveals her occupation and shares that she is a divorced single mother. Knowing that it would now be easy for a suspect to open up about himself, Evelyn asks his name. He starts by saying that his name is Douglas and he has numerous children, his dogs. No human he found his whole life is more beautiful, brave, and faithful than dogs. His remarkable love for dogs is rooted in his childhood when his father brought them home. Unfortunately, the father and brother starved them to prepare for fights. His pathetic father only knew the expressions of hate and violence, and he made his living through earning from dogfights. It stuns Evelyn to see that besides passing through a traumatic past, Douglas is so calm. He shares his fondest childhood memory that roots back to her mom cooking in the kitchen and listening to music. But that lasted only until their father arrived and started hitting and punching his mom because he suspected that she secretly fed his dogs. As a little affectionate boy, he sometimes saves his food to give to dogs. On an unfortunate day, Douglas's brother sees him, and that devil in a human's disguise tells father the news in the spiciest way. Father drags him from the dinner table that day and locks him up with the dogs. His weak and terrified mother knew she couldn't help him, so she soon left the house to give a better life to his upcoming offspring. But before going away, she had tears in her eyes and a lot of food cans that she gave Douglas to hide in the cage. After that day, she never saw her again. Douglas learned about the world through a pile of magazines her mother hid beside the cage. He saw the most challenging weather, countless days and lonely nights in the cage, but his father never pitied him. The session ends at that point, and Evelyn returns home to the terrible news from her mother that her psychotic ex-husband has been circling the house. Contrary to what Evelyn told Douglas, that she had a perfect childhood and a good life, she had a violent father and husband. Evelyn could not calm her mom on the matter despite her best efforts. Teenager Douglas watches his cruel brother preaching to him God's verses from the Bible from outside the cage. He lives a sad life in a cage, dirty as a pig, malnourished, and unable to move due to weakness. In Douglas's recent residence, the abandoned building, a terrified-looking boy enters and seeks a way to talk. Douglas opens the door, and the boy gives a message from a poor laundry girl that a mob is demanding money in the name of property protection, and she wants his help. He provides the stray dog she sent him, and Douglas promises to help them. The next day, the gang's chief enters a club while a small dog follows him and puts a phone sent by Douglas on his table. The phone rings, and the next moment, another dog puts its fangs on the chief's penis, ready to chew it. On the other end of the call, Douglas instructs the chief to stop entering the poor lady's shop any further, or the dog will not hesitate to chew his gonads. Unable to move, Chief does what he is asked, and the dogs run back from where they came. Douglas, sitting outside in a wheelchair in a pretty lady's attire, gracefully leaves the scene and reaches home. He, one after another, removes everything from his face that gives him a stunning look. He then takes a bath and lies on the bed to sleep. Besides getting the court's order to restrain Evelyn's husband from entering her house premises, he is again found whirling there. Annoyed, Evelyn calls him en route to Douglas's house but fails to convince him. The house had a horrible and messy look. Besides, the stinking made it even worse, resulting from numerous corpses on the whole floor. She gathers the required things and brings them to police headquarters. Douglas asks for these things. He looks much better and neat and is grateful for the coffee cup. He thanks her for the last interrogation, which made him feel better, and welcomes any more questioning. Evelyn now wants to know how her period of incarceration ended and where he spent the rest of his life before she was 18. He has no idea how many days, months, or years he was in the cage, but on an unfortunate day, his merciless brother saw him patting newborn puppies and immediately brought Dad to kill them, despite his pleading to hide this. Always burning in rage, his father brings the gun, but Douglas stands in front of the cage to become a shelter for his dogs. The more his father enraged, the more he resisted. In that mad moment, his father fires the bullet that cuts Douglas's pinky finger, and he lies on the ground still. His brother takes the terrified father inside the house, letting him die there. But that day, Douglas decided to seek help by showing a police car picture to the dog and putting his finger in a Ziploc bag. The dog finds the car and puts the finger in front of the windscreen. It took them a moment to understand the magnitude of the crime, but the whole police squad rescued him and arrested his father and brother. Sadly, Douglas's freedom came with a price. The bullet hit his finger, struck the wall, and came back to his spine, leaving him crippled for life. Now, any step he walks depletes his bone marrow, so he stays in a wheelchair. After 20 days in jail, his father committed suicide, but his brother came out after 8 years. His faithful dogs waited for him to come out and surrounded him from all sides, eventually killing him. After treatment, Douglas got a place in a care home, where he never befriended other kids. They had a strange sense of insecurities and mixed love-hate emotions. In that period, he met Selma. She introduced him to Shakespeare, and ultimately, they acted together in all the dramas written by Shakespeare. Selma was an extraordinary, pretty, and talented actress. But before Douglas could express his love for her, she moved to another city for a theater job. From that day, Douglas started collecting each piece of the newspaper with the news of her access. Finally, she made her way into Broadway theater, and after a mesmerizing performance, Douglas went backstage to give her flowers. She immediately recognizes him. It was shocking for her to see that he collected all the news about her all these years, and she kissed him. A handsome guy enters the next moment, and Selma introduces him as her husband. With immense sadness in his eyes, unable to utter any word, Douglas heard the words. She shows the book to her husband and shares the news with Douglas that she is pregnant. As a BSc in biology, he runs a dog shelter. That night, Douglas has a panic attack, and he repeatedly bangs his head with the net. Watching him becoming breathless and falling on the floor, his dog unlocks the door and licks his body. Following the complaints from owners who got the dogs from the shelter the next day, the community representatives handed him the notice to vacate the premises before Monday. They discreetly summoned the news, looking terrified of his dogs. On that day, they find no one in the shelter. Douglas moves into the vacant building with all his dogs. He spends nights reading Shakespeare to his dogs while hunting the jobs of a biologist in the day. After hundreds of applications, he had no luck. One day in front of a club, he stops to see the artist and asks the director to give him a chance to sing. Initially, he refuses, but when Douglas assures that the audience will see him sing while standing on stage, the director is stunned to see him standing and recruits him as a singer in a girl's disguise every Friday. On his first Friday, he puts on makeup and gives his first performance. Watching him perform beautifully, the director gives him the job. That way, he started putting food for himself. But for numerous dogs, it was insufficient. But as they understood every word of him and brought every cooking ingredient too, they knew how to get money home. One night, one dog entered through a window and opened another bigger window for the rest of the dogs. They steal a few expensive items from a house, including a costly necklace. The owner of the house reported the theft to the insurance company. They resisted believing that someone could commit robbery in a closed house, and the man decided to investigate the matter thoroughly. He gives an immense amount of time to see the CCTV footage of all 8 cameras around the house. Unfortunately, the house had no camera inside. Suddenly, he stops the footage, seeing 2 dogs entering the house. The more detailed footage shows multiple dogs entering from multiple sides of the house, and he finally spots a dog taking a necklace in his mouth out of the house. He knows exactly where the dog took it and decides to follow the lead. The insurance agent collects the information on Douglas, checks his records, and reaches the club. He sees the performance and gets permission to visit him backstage. He admires the singing and proves himself the biggest fan. But Douglas refuses his offer of dinner. That night, the agent follows him to the abandoned building and discreetly enters. With a gun in his hand, he carefully walks between the dogs when Douglas opens the door to his room. All the dogs disappear into the small hole, leaving 2 of them alone. The agent points his gun and immediately demands the jewelry items he stole using his dogs. Relaxed and calm, Douglas, cooking food, tells him the code. The agent receives all the jewelry and accepts Douglas's offer to eat with him, not knowing the fluffy and cotton-like clothes on the couch are not blankets, but Douglas's dog that suddenly attacks the agent. Afterward, the other dogs hiding come out running and chew the agent's body. Evelyn intimidates Douglas at this point that he is confessing a heinous crime, and he can be sentenced for the confession. But he seems fearless now. Douglas finally begins telling what happened the day he came to the police station. The gang's chief and many men barged into his building that day. He brought the innocent guy who brought a security complaint to Douglas and murdered him in the hallway. Douglas gets ready with a gun for a deadly shootout and loads his weapon, keeping a few bullets in his clothes. Meanwhile, a dog chews a man, looking for them in a small hole. 2 others search Douglas on separate routes, and amid the shootout, the dogs electrocute one man. Another guy becomes a target of Douglas's bullet when he follows a dog. A guy falls on a broken floor, and the dog pushes another inside. Douglas shoots both of them in the hole. Watching the intense situation, the chief calls for more guys to join them in the building. By that time, Douglas had started shooting bullets at him. After a while, Douglas falls on the floor because he cannot stand for more than a few minutes and crawls his body back into the room. The chief follows and enters the hallway just before the room. By that time, Douglas had settled himself in the room on his wheelchair, pouring red wine for himself with trembling hands. Not knowing why he is so confident, challenges Chief that he can shoot him for all he wants. But as he pulls the trigger and finds that there is no bullet left in the gun, he gets terrified for his life. Douglas survives, but when the chief looks around and sees several dogs looking at him like minced meat, he tries to do something. But before he could do anything, the dogs attacked and killed him. That day, police arrest him, and a sergeant asks him what will happen with his dogs after he goes to prison. Douglas knows that his dogs are most learned, brave animals. So he confidently tells the sergeant that dogs know what to do. In the next moment, the dogs run away. Evelyn is quite shocked to hear Douglas's story. He now has a stronger belief in God, but Evelyn wants to know why he opened up with her. Why did he choose to tell the whole story without lying to her? He says they have one thing in common, pain, which made him share his story. With tears in her eyes, Evelyn leaves the room. That night, Douglas ends his story with Evelyn, and a dog watches her get in the car to go home. While with the immense peace of a calm man, Douglas smiles, smoking a cigarette. Just before dawn, the dogs from the streets of the whole city start running towards the police headquarters. On the other hand, Douglas removes the jail clothes and starts getting ready for the big day. Suddenly, a dog enters the police station, and when the sergeant takes a closer look, it attacks and the sergeant falls unconscious. Dogs get the keys and run towards the jail barracks. On the other hand, Douglas wears the dress and watches a key under the door that a skinny dog threw. He picks it up, unlocks the door, and enjoys the reunion with his children and dogs. Douglas leaves his wheelchair and opens the main door of police headquarters. He walks with enormous difficulty towards the church. Evelyn reaches home and picks the baby in her lap. Douglas could not stand on his feet. All his dogs gather around while he surrenders himself before God. Unable to walk further toward the church, he falls. All his cats surround him, and Evelyn watches a dog looking at her from the window as if it is giving a message. Despite turning into a monster after receiving violence and spending countless days in the cage, Douglas turned into the kindest man for kind people. But under that core, he taught his dogs without training them to end the tyrants.